The General Post Office, or GPO, was originally completed in 1818 on Sackville Street, now called O'Connell Street, and was originally built as a post office. It still is a post office, and it was a post office in 1916. Now, this begs the question of what's so special about a post office, because I suppose for anyone looking at the Easter Rising, the GPO was the building that symbolises it more than anything else. It may not have been the building or locality that saw the heaviest level of fighting, but it was certainly the area that witnessed the highest levels of destruction in the course of the suppression of the Rising. And the GPO, I suppose, has a symbolic value as the building that, I suppose, for many people symbolises the Easter Rising and, by extension, Irish independence. Why was the GPO seized? There are a couple of possibilities. It has been suggested that as a large state institution on the north side of the city, it had a certain symbolic value. There might also simply be the fact that the GPO on Sackville Street was a large public building on a very large and public street. Sackville Street had been used for political demonstrations throughout the 19th century and beyond. It may simply have been chosen because if you did something in and around the GPO, it would undoubtedly be noticed. Another reason why the GPO may have been seized is that it was, well, a communications hub, a centre of telegraph communications in particular. There may have been an idea that by seizing the GPO, you would disrupt communications in the city and, crucially, more broadly, both nationally and across the United Kingdom. Now, given the fact that other venues of communication weren't seized in the same way, that I suppose ultimately turned out to be a futile exercise. But it may well have been a factor in the choice of the building. At around midday on the 24th of April 1916, about 150 members of the insurgent forces, primarily the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army, Cumann na mBan, would have marched up Abbey Street, marched up O'Connell Street, and would have been led by Joseph Plunkett, James Connolly, Patrick Pearse would all have been involved at this time. Members of the Irish Volunteers were often accused by their Redmondite rivals of being, shirkers, that they had chosen this other organisation in an attempt to avoid service in the Great War and were often castigated as cowards. This wasn't unique to Dublin, this happened across the country, and it should be borne in mind that before April 1916, there was no reason to think that the Irish Volunteers was a serious organisation. What had it done? Now, so the sight of this organisation marching through the Dublin city centre was not unusual. What was unusual is that when the column drew level with the GPO, they charged inside, seized the building, began to clear the building of customers, and in the course of clearing members of the public and members of staff out of the building, a number of soldiers who were on guard in the building would have been captured, and they would have remained in the building for the remainder of the week. It should be said that the first couple of days of the Easter Rising weren't necessarily characterised by heavy fighting. That would come later on in the week. And I suppose the immediate preoccupation once the building had been seized was making it habitable. Impromptu fortifications would have been devised using, post office ledgers, bits of furniture, sandbags, mailbags, whatever came to hand. Mailbags more than sandbags, I should say. And these would have been placed in the front windows of the post office, which would have been smashed out. The post office at that time looked very, very different to what it does today. Ultimately, perhaps only the facade of the building survived the Easter Rising. And the building, ironically enough, had been reopened after a very expensive renovation about 6 weeks before it was occupied on the 24th of April. So the interior of the building would have looked quite different and would have had a very, very different structure to the building that exists today. Even aside from trying to fortify the GPO itself, barricades would have been set up in the surrounding localities. Bedding and food would have been seized from various department stores and businesses in the area. O'Connell Street or Sackville Street was a commercial district then, just as it is now. And these were scenes that were replicated in various volunteer positions throughout the city. From a fairly early stage on Monday, the Dublin Metropolitan Police were taken off the streets of Dublin. So to a certain extent, law and order began to break down, and in the area of Sackville Street, looting began to break out. Now bear in mind that Sackville Street would have backed onto some areas of pretty horrific slum poverty. There were tenements very, very close to the shopping district, and it does seem that people from the tenements did come down and begin to loot the various businesses. In terms of the numbers involved, at the start of the week, the GPO was seized by perhaps 150 insurgents. By the end of the week, there were perhaps 400 in the GPO and the immediate locality. In every position that was seized by the volunteers during the Easter Rising, a central building would have been taken and attempts were made to fortify it, but outlying positions or locations were also seized. Shops on the corner of what's now North Earl Street, shops on the corner of Sackville Street facing onto the Liffey. There was some limited fighting in the first couple of days of the Easter Rising. On the afternoon of the 24th of April, Lancers, mounted troops, came from Marlborough Barracks, so coming down from the north end of Sackville Street, and were fired upon from the GPO. Some of the horses were killed and lay there, apparently putrefying in what was then a rather warm April for the remainder of the week. The real heavy fighting came later in the week. most especially from Wednesday onwards when substantial British reinforcements began to enter the city itself, both from other installations around Ireland, but most especially as troop ships began to arrive in Dublin Port, bringing troops across the Irish Sea. O'Connell Street and its environs began to be shelled, and the British military would have used incendiary shells on this area. Now think of the impact of that in a commercial district. There was a lot of stuff, there was a lot of stuff to loot, there was a great deal of material to burn as well. A pharmaceutical warehouse was amongst one of the early locations that was hit, and within a matter of hours on Thursday, the entire eastern side of O'Connell Street would have been an inferno. Members of the volunteers in the GPO recall watching plate glass windows on the other side of O'Connell Street in department stores melt into the gutter, and they themselves would have been scorched by the ferocity of the blaze within the building itself. Now, the building did contain, I suppose, what would have been called, what you could term, the headquarter staff involved of the volunteers. People such as Patrick Pearse, Thomas Clark, Sean McDermott, Joseph Mary Plunkett. They all would have been present in the GPO. And there are recollections of conversations that these individuals had, some of which posed questions over precisely what they actually wanted. Thomas Clark apparently remarked, when asked why were he and his colleagues demanding a republic, he apparently remarked that, well, you needed something to capture people's imaginations. There's a fairly well-rehearsed and well-recounted story of Pearse and Plunkett discussing, quite seriously, the prospect of installing a German prince, a relative of the Kaiser, on a putative Irish throne, which implies that perhaps they were just after the substance of independence rather than its particular form. The GPO itself was hit from Friday onwards, and as it was being hit with incendiary devices, the building began to burn, the roof began to collapse, and a decision was made to abandon it. Now, the idea was that those inside, numbering perhaps about 400, would escape from the GPO, make their way across the city to King's Inn Street, where there was a large factory, Williams and Woods. The building is still actually there, and they would kind of hold up there again. They escaped from the GPO by leaving from the side exits towards Moore Street and also Moore Lane. One individual who was involved in this attempted escape was a young man called Sean McLaughlin, a member of the volunteers who had been born in North King Street and was familiar with the locality and was apparently given credentials by James Connolly to try and oversee the escape from the GPO. As they made their way into the network of lanes in and around Moore Street, however, they realised that they were trapped. They smashed into buildings. One volunteer apparently shot out his own throat by using the butt of a rifle to try and smash a door. The daughter of a family living on Moore Street was killed when other volunteers shot through her at the door of a family home, and they ensconced themselves in the terrace. They tried to smash through buildings to try and see was there any escape route, but they realised as they did so that the British cordon that had been thrown around the city centre went across the end of Moore Street. So they were kind of very close to, British military positions, but more importantly, they were trapped, and in the terrace of buildings they made a decision to surrender. The garrison that had fought in the GPO, members of Cumann na mBan, members of the Irish Citizen Army, members of the Irish Volunteers, they were detained in the gardens of the Rotunda Hospital before being marched back down Sackville Street, past Trinity College, and down Dame Street, out towards the west of the city, where many of them were detained in Richmond Barracks. It's ironic that despite the fact that GPO had been reopened after a very expensive renovation 6 weeks before its occupation, within 7 weeks of its reopening it was a burnt-out hulk. The building did not reopen for business until 1929, and even then in a drastically rebuilt form.